We now move on to Holli Levitsky. She holds degrees in English language and literature. She lives from the University of Michigan. She works primarily in the areas of Jewish American literature, Holocaust studies, and exile studies. She's published many books, many articles, books, chapters on the subject. So I welcome Holli.
Thank you, Rony. In 2001, I took a year-long post at Warsaw University as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Literature. I offered the Polish University's first ever course on the Holocaust. I learned quickly that it was unlikely my students there had ever met a Jew before me. They knew little about Jewish history, including Polish Jewish history. I thus faced the task of teaching Polish students about their own history. It became clear that while I was prepared to teach the Holocaust they were expecting me to teach was not my Holocaust. I chose to begin a course that I titled America in the Holocaust with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which had been the recent subject in Poland of national debates questioning the role of Poles during the Holocaust. During our lively class discussions, I was sympathetic to student concerns about the depiction of Poles as bad pigs, which was what was really at the center of their national debates. And they in turn became more intrigued by their nation's Polish Jewish history. Their misinformation about Polish Jewish history and Holocaust history in general gave me a door into their reality. So in our first informal discussions about their nation's history, I asked students to share family stories, and what came out immediately were, on their own terms, heroic relatives and tragic circumstances. This included grandparents fighting Nazis in the Warsaw Uprising or with the Home Army, and relatives sent away as slave laborers. Almost every student, in fact, shared that someone in their family had saved or helped a Jew or a Jewish family, though no one could actually cite the name of a saved Jew or Jewish family. But since the graphic novel began in a pre-war Polish world where non-Jews and Jews lived parallel and sometimes assimilated lives, Mouse became a helpful classroom illustration of the competing narratives of non-Jewish and Jewish Poles. What I mean is, Mouse showed not just the stratification of pre-war life in Poland, but the ramifications of being a Jew or a Gentile in those circumstances. And this was important for our classroom work. For Spiegelman, Mouse was a way to tell a family story. So I turned to that shape for our course project. And I asked students for their course project to interview and then creatively tell the story of a family member who was alive during World War II. So just to remind you, this was 2001, 2002. So quite a few years ago and just after 9/11. Specifically in this project, they had to ask this relative what they remembered about Jews from before and during the war and include that into the project. So the submitted projects were incredibly imaginative. Polish people are very artistic, and my students had learned so many different skills and arts and crafts. And so these stories took the form of just very tangible things: scrapbooks, storybooks, diaries, visual narratives, three-dimensional structures, and more. And they used, to outline the stories, they used musical scores for one grandmother who was a musician, paper aging processes, linen, twine, paper mache, various printing techniques. They clearly took a lot of care in this project. More importantly, though, students made surprising discoveries that really burst asunder many of the platitudes they'd shared in our informal class discussions about their families. So I'm going to share two examples quickly. The first example, which was titled Interview with My Father, and it was printed as a book. Anna, I think I had 6 Annas in this class, so Anna interviewed her father, who a man who loved history, and as she was growing up had always quizzed her on facts and dates from Polish history. So he tells Anna he doesn't know any Jews, but he heard a lot about Jews from her grandfather, who was a shoemaker. And he quotes his father, her grandfather. He would say, "They were cunning as foxes and joined their forces to make Polish sellers bankrupt. They took us for enemies, and in consequence, we considered them as such. What really makes me angry," this is the grandfather still, "what really makes me angry is that they always called themselves Polish Jews. They separated themselves from the society." And then her father says, "Your grandfather strongly disliked them. He often told Jewish jokes and he laughed at them." Her father continues to deny remembering any Jews specifically, but adds that, quote, "Jews were always villains, and their very presence caused a stir that," he said, "often led to war." So sadly, in the book, she neither reflects on this deeper historical anti-Semitism suggested by her grandfather's hateful words, and she doesn't call out her father's anti-Semitic views, but we talked about it in class. In the second illustration, Pavel, he put it together as a leather-bound, kind of a leather-bound diary. Pavel wrote, and he titled it "Fragments of My Grandfather's War." He wrote about his grandfather. He interviewed his grandfather, a carpenter who fought in the Home Army. And he relates the respect received by Polish officers in the POW camps by the Germans. He said the Poles received so many packages from international organizations that the Germans bought bread from them. And they were encouraged to sing the Polish national anthem and other Polish songs. And he just records this as the interview continues. And then he adds his own commentary, Pavel does, the student. He says, "Well, after hearing this story, I remembered rumors of Jewish ancestry in my family, which had long been circulating." And Pavel tries to get his grandfather to verify what he calls the innuendo that his grandmother was Jewish by descent. He has very sound suspicions, but his grandfather denies it and denies it. Pavel writes that my grandmother's physical type was rather distinctive, but both my grandparents denied it, and my grandfather said again, no, she was not a Jew. Pavel describes the source of this denial or repression from his family as emerging from an incident he learns from his grandfather. So his grandmother was in Ravensbrück, forced labor camp as a Pole, and she had gotten a very easy post, I guess, in the kitchen, I think. And a coworker who wanted her job reported her to the commander as a Jew. And nobody knows the conclusion to the story. That's all he hears from the grandfather. But Pavel concludes that she managed to clear herself. Obviously, if she did not, she probably would have been executed right on the spot, or at best deported to a death camp. This, as well as the post-war persecution of Jews, would probably be more than enough to conceal her racial identity for her whole life. This is Pavel reflecting on this. So after reading all of these 30 or so stories, scrapbooks, et cetera, and seeing the lack of, the lack of awareness students had, for me, it was, for instance, when the 2018 Polish legislation passed that would essentially criminalize any mention of Polish complicity in the Holocaust, the heated global controversy really came home to me from this experience I had with Polish students. How differently Poles, Jewish Poles and non-Jewish Poles perceive their entire history still is really something that we need to confront in post-memory. Because while I found the misinformation and the anti-Semitism unsettling, it wasn't surprising. And in my research, I've looked at textbooks over several decades in Poland. And unfortunately, contemporary primary, secondary, university textbooks don't make clear why Jews who lived in a country for over 1,000 years suddenly disappeared. So they're simply not being taught. And what I had to do was then go in and teach Polish Jewish history. So my class learned that Jews were one of several minorities that lived in Poland for centuries, that they had engaged each other, Jews and non-Jews in Poland, for all that time in regular, even daily, neighborly, social, commercial, and other kinds of interactions before World War II. And finally, I could help them conclude that during the Holocaust, many of these Poles did act heroically toward their Jewish neighbors. But nonetheless, it was a different narrative. So discussing scenes from Maus in class, my students identified with the helpful Poles in the book, like Pani Matnova, who offered Wladek and Anya safety for a time in her cellar, as long as her husband didn't know. Seeing their behavior, the Poles saw this behavior as a sign of continued Polish goodwill toward their Jewish neighbors. And one student verbalized in class what I sensed was a commonly held sentiment. In Maus, the fact that no Jews would have survived without help from Poles is never brought out. So I continued to the last day with them to make them aware that when the laws changed under occupation and being Jewish becomes criminalized, basically, and by this new definition could be neither law-abiding nor citizens of that state, Polish citizens could keep their Polish identity. They could walk on streets, shop in stores, eat at restaurants, live in their own homes. They could help their neighbors or not, but Jews had no such choices. By laws, directives, and resolutions, Jews were required to gather and be removed when called. The machinery of a final solution in place. Life was uncertain for Poles. I conceded this to my students, and it was certainly difficult, and their stories show that. But Poles were not presented with the same final terms as the Jews. And this is where the perspective and the narratives sharply diverge. Productively working through Maus in memory in the Polish classroom really brought me closer to an understanding of the nature of conflicting Holocaust narratives of Polish Jews and non-Jews. Michael Rothberg conceives a space where such conflicting narratives confront one another, potentially, though not necessarily, creating sympathy between groups, suggesting that memory works productively through negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing. The result of memory conflict is not less memory, but more, even of subordinated memory traditions. But my question remained, and that is it possible to work through these conflicting historical memories of the Holocaust without endorsing historically inaccurate narratives? The literature classroom for me opened up a space where the tragic separateness of experience could be at least identified, creating a common goal to understand the other's experience. The work produced more memory in everyone. And in that, I think, succeeded in moving us forward. Using Maus to teach Polish students the history of Jews in Poland was an opportunity to use creative literature, my field, as a practice much closer to the truth. The experience itself opened my mind and my heart to the personal stories of individual Poles, just as my stories opened their minds to questions they had not known to ask. That does not exempt moral failure, nor does it place blame on future generations. It asks that as teachers we strive to become cultural diplomats, seeking out partners within our shared text to create interculturally competent citizens of the world. Thank you.